I'm really excited for this session. Francis and I have done quite a bit of climbing together. I really admire Francis's decision-making skills in the outdoors. He's probably one of the safest people outdoors I've ever been with, I think. So I am super excited to get him to chat to us more about decision making.
It's nice to meet everyone here. A real privilege to meet you all. It's actually been, and this is kind of skipping a few steps ahead. It's been a fascinating process to have the opportunity to really think about decision making again. It's something that I actually find really interesting, and it's almost helpful and enjoyable to come back and go, okay, well, let's talk about decision making because we don't talk about it that much. We do heaps of it, but we don't talk about it. And it's just been a great mental journey to go on exploring all the different aspects of it in preparation for tonight. So I've really enjoyed that. As Nick alluded to, I've been a trustee with Mastering Mountains for, I think, about 3 years now. And to meet people, I mean, it's not in person, but to meet grant recipients online is a privilege for me. We read all of your applications, and in many ways, doing that, I feel like I get to know some of you. But your names, and occasionally I follow your Instagram pages and that kind of thing. But to actually have the opportunity to meet you and hear some of your stories, hopefully, is really, really great. So a little bit about me. My background comes from a passion of climbing and mountaineering. I grew up in the UK and spent lots of time over there developing climbing and mountaineering skills myself, and then transitioned those into becoming a mountaineering instructor. Spent lots of time coaching people in a variety of outdoor settings. So whether that was in the mountains or sometimes out on lakes and rivers, doing kayaking and those kind of things, but everything was really focused around the mountains. And I think the mountains are a great environment to hone decision making because they're so dynamic, but equally, we can use our experiences in day-to-day life to talk about decisions that we might make and to refine and improve our decision-making abilities for the times that we go out into the outdoors. And we'll discuss that a little bit later. Outside of that instructional side of things, I was fortunate enough to spend about 5 years in New Zealand, where I took on the business leadership role, I guess, within the YMCA and worked closely with managers of outdoor recreation businesses and spent a lot of time coaching them to make good decisions with regards to the business's finances, the business's culture, but also the business's outdoor aspects. They're all outdoor businesses. So that was something that I really enjoyed. And most recently here in Australia, I work for an emergency service. If any of you are familiar with Australia, it's something called the State Emergency Service, which is pretty unique. It's the agency that's in charge of combating floods. And Australia has lots of floods, which I think is a surprise to some people. But we have really catastrophic floods, cyclone caused quite often, as recently happened up in the north of Queensland. And so I have a role which part of that is around triaging and decision making with regards to flood rescues. So we may end up with a day where we get 1,500 emergency calls to 000 of people in different levels of distress as a result of flooding. Some people might be stood in ankle deep water, and some people might be sat on their car as it floats off down a raging river. And my role is basically to work out what the best response is to those individual circumstances. So all of that is the background that I'll be looking at some of this decision making, but I enjoy everything that's outdoors. And as I said before, we'll try to reflect on how our day-to-day lives involve lots of decision making and what we can learn in our day-to-day that we can transfer through to when we're in the outdoors. I had a bit of issues trying to get the PowerPoint to work, but what would pop up if my PowerPoint was working is a picture of my wife and daughter right now. So you can imagine little 19-month-old Lucy and my wife Sarah And the reason I put that picture in is because when we think about our decisions, we almost our decisions wouldn't matter so much if we were the only ones that were impacted by them, but we're not. The people around us are the ones that often feel the consequences of our decisions. And I think for me, it's a focus, or it's something that drives the focus on my passion to make better decisions when I'm in the outdoors, because the outdoors can be dangerous, and the various challenges that you've all applied for grants for ultimately do have an element of danger to them. And the reality is that when you're taking part in a outdoor activity and then you also have medical needs or medical challenges, then those risks are harder to manage and are more apparent at times. And so we have to be aware of the context around our decisions and those that are impacted by them. So that's me in a nutshell. Today we're going to talk lots about decision making, and there's lots of opportunity for discussion. So to kick things off, when thinking about this in the first instance, something that I quite like to do is have a look at what are the classic quotes with regards to the topic that we're discussing, because I'm no expert in this. I have a bit of experience. I don't have a degree in psychology. There's many wiser people out there that could talk on this topic, and I feel a bit inadequate really to be taking on such a large topic. But what I wanted to share with you is a selection of quotes. I'll read them out in a moment, and then whilst I'm reading them, and this is going to be our first point of discussion, if people are comfortable, is to say which of these sort of resonates with you, why, and just from these quotes, what can we learn about decision making? So the first one: sometimes you make the right decision, sometimes you make the decision right. Secondly, decision making is easy when your values are clear. Truly successful decision making relies on a balance between deliberate and instinctive thinking. Great decision making comes from the ability to create the time and space to think rationally and intelligently about the issue at hand. And never make a decision when you're upset, sad, jealous, or in love. So 5 quotes there. Is anyone willing to unmute themselves and say which one resonates with you, why, and if there's anything that you feel like you can learn even just from those 5 quotes there?
To me, is the number 3 as someone that resonates, because for me, like decision making, I know I took a decision when I start, like it's gut feel, and when I stop thinking about it. Like when I stop mulling over, I know the decision is there when it's like, everything is at peace.
Yep, absolutely. That's great. And that's definitely something we'll come on to a little bit later, that gut feeling versus giving yourself the space and time. Thanks, Rafaela.
Yeah, for me, it's that number 4 one. It reminds me of that, is it Viktor Frankl quote, between stimulus and response, about creating a gap between the stimulus and the response so you're not reactive and you're actually intentionally creating some space to consider what your options are, and you're not just reacting or panicking into a response.
Yeah.
So it reminds me of that. Yeah.
Cool. That's great. Thanks, Kirsten.
I really enjoyed that second quote about sort of using your values to direct your decision making. And I think that like going back to your comment, Francis, about considering the context, like family and that kind of stuff. Obviously, for me also, sort of value my family and but also other goals beyond just sort of achieving something. And so the values aspect of it, I think, is really clarifying. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Nick.
I like the actually a combination between 1 and 3, because I work with boards of trustees and directors, and it's mostly about decision making. And so I've looked a lot at deliberate and instinctive decision making, and the instinctive decision making can be learned by deliberately practicing. And I think that's what number one refers to. Sometimes you make the right decision, sometimes you make the decision right. So it's thinking in advance, how am I going to approach if XYZ happens on the face of the mountain? How am I going to respond? And so that when that moment comes, there's not enough time to think rationally, but man, it's going to need to be so instinctive.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and that's absolutely going to be a key focus. And we'll watch a video shortly from somebody called Gordy Graham, whose background is in the fire service, where people are facing decisions that require them to act what appears to be instinctively, but the way they can act instinctively is through preparation and planning for those decisions. And I think that's what you're referring to there a little bit, Peter. We'll move on. So I noted when Nick sent out the topic of this the conversation, and this isn't to throw him under the bus, but he called it something along the lines of how to make good decisions in the outdoors. And I went, oh, I don't know what a good decision is. And this comes to this first point and what Peter was mentioning, which is sometimes you make the right decision and sometimes you make the decision right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of an example. It's very mundane and similar to what we just did. I'll ask for examples from anyone that's willing to share. So an example of a good decision that I made this week, or a decision that I made this week, was this morning. I woke up at 5:45. I'm down in Sydney today, and I had to get to the airport to fly down to Sydney. So the decision I made was to wake up at 5:45 to go to the airport. That was my decision. At a surface level, was it a good decision? Well, yes, I arrived at the airport on time. Can somebody share a decision that they've made today that they'd be willing for us to discuss as an example as we work through?
I can give an example. So today we were discussing which beach we were going to go. So we checked the wind forecast because we wanted to go down south because my husband wanted to fish. But then the places where we wanted to go were too windy, so we changed our destination. We didn't fish.
Great. So that's fantastic. And when you made your decision to go to the first beach and you arrived there, was it a bad decision to go to the beach?
That's a philosophical question.
Mm.
No.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to go to the beach, so it was the main purpose of the day.
Yeah. Great. Okay. So what I wanted to explore here is that if we focus on the outcome of the decision, so we focus on, well, was it a good beach to go to, then it's often tied to a range of factors that are outside our ability to control, coordinate, and reasonably predict. And so for me this morning, when I decided that I was going to wake up at 5:45, to judge whether that was a good decision, what I should not look at is whether I got to the airport in time to catch the flight, but what I should look at is the process that I went through to decide what time to wake up. And so when I was trying to work out what time to wake up, I assessed the likely conditions and made adjustments based on these. So, for example, I looked at what the weather was going to be doing in the morning, and in an extreme case, it might have been a snowstorm. So that was an assessment that I made. I had a look at what might be the likely traffic. So I used previous experience to say, hey, well, 6 o'clock in the morning, there's not much traffic, so I don't need to factor that into my decision. I built a contingency in to allow for the unexpected. So what if my daughter was awake at 5:30 and was running about the house? Would that speed up my process to leave the house, or would it slow down my process to leave the house? And I'd build a contingency in for that. I assessed previous experiences to inform me of the likely outcomes. So How long does it usually take me to make a cup of coffee in the morning, to get dressed, to walk out to the car, to put the bags in the car? All of those factors we use to build into making the decision to wake up at 5:45. Now, what might have happened is I walk out to the car and I've got a flat tire, and I then don't make it on time for the flight. However, was it a bad decision to wake up at 5:45? Well, no, not necessarily. I don't think it would be. And so I want to instill a context, I suppose, that we look at our decision making and the quality of our decision making around the decision making process rather than the outcome of the individual decision. And we look for themes rather than individual items. So if it's a general theme that I keep turning up to the airport late, then there's probably a flaw within my decision making. And so I need to go back to the process and go, okay, well, what is it that I keep missing here? And if we can focus around that, then it enables us to firstly forgive ourselves a little bit easier when things don't work out as we planned. But it also gives us a mentality that's built around reflection. And so we're not necessarily outcome driven, we're process driven. And I think that's a real strength for people that are making decisions. And so, Rafaela, when you said you thought that it was a good decision to go to the beach even though it was windy, yeah, it sounded like you assessed some conditions and you looked at various factors and you said, okay, we'll give this a go, and we'll cover on it a little bit later. And I'll share with you a bit of a framework to make decisions, to make your first decision or your primary path forwards, your secondary path forwards, your emergency path. And sounds like you're already down that track a little bit, even just in your day-to-day activities, which was that you turned up at the beach and you already had your second option in mind. And a lot of this is instinctive, and we do it every day. We're constantly assessing risk. If you drive, you're constantly assessing risk of other cars, other people on the road. But the more we can be aware of the processes we're going through in our day-to-day lives, the easier it is to transfer them into new environments, and those new environments might be the outdoors. We're going to watch a video now, and I was in two minds about it, but it's a fantastic video. It goes for about 14 minutes. As I said earlier, somebody called Gordy Graham, who is delivering a lecture to American firefighters. It is quite American. He talks about ice cream. He talks about decision making. He talks about lots of topics. It's quite an entertaining video. And I thought to myself, well, there's no point me taking all the concepts that he discusses here and delivering them secondhand to you when you can hear it firsthand.
Most of what you do, in spite of the extremely complex nature of your job, you end up doing right. My hat's off to you, ladies and gentlemen. In spite of the complex nature of the job, most of what you do right. There's a reason why. Every one of these incidents that you get involved in can be put into one of these four boxes. You know, this is important stuff. This is the classic risk frequency analysis. Risk and frequency. By the end of my little talk here today, I want this prominent in your mind. Some things you do in the fire service are what I call high-risk events. Definition: if they don't go right, the consequences in civil court, personal injury, organizational embarrassment are high. Some of what you do are called low-risk events. Definition: if it goes bad, the consequences are low. Some things you do a lot, high frequency. Some things you do rarely, low frequency. The risk frequency analysis. Firefighters get in trouble for two things, folks. Intentional misconduct, that happens, but it's rare. Most of what gets us in trouble, gets you in trouble, are mistakes. Study the consequences. Study the consequences. Mistakes happen. Where do mistakes happen? Very rarely do you end up in trouble on high-frequency events. High-frequency events, things you do all the time, generally don't cause you problems. Why? Because of a wonderful tool known as RPDM, Recognition Prime Decision Making. Recognition, prime decision making. And you can read all the books out there that are on neural linguistic programming, and my doctor friends out here in the audience hopefully will be able to back me up on this. But there's all sorts of studies about how do we think things through, and a lot of these were done back in the 50s and 60s, and a lot of these studies involve fire departments. And they came up with this concept of RPDM. Recognition, prime decision making. Your brain is this massive hard drive loaded with information, billions of gigabytes of data stored in this massive hard drive, and when you get involved in any incident, the brain scans it, beep, 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 looks for a match in the already existing hard drive, finds the match, and automatically directs behavior based on past behavior that ended up with a successful result. That's RPDM. It works. It works. When mistakes occur, folks, they're over here on the low frequency events. And I'm not worried about these, the low risk, low frequency events, because even if they go bad, the consequences are relatively small. Where I get all worked up, folks, where I get all worked up, and where I want you to be getting worked up, as a mom, as a dad, as a chief, as a firefighter, as a union leader, I don't care who you are. Where I want you getting worked up is right here. High risk, low frequency events. High consequence, low probability events. These are the ones that historically and probability-wise have the highest likelihood of ending up downstream in nasty consequences. This is the incident that's got the highest probability of causing you grief. Why? Because your hard drive is empty, ladies and gentlemen. It's high risk, low frequency. I practice what I preach. My boy and I are buying a new boat. Mrs. Graham doesn't know that right now, so keep it secret. But our dream is to fly up to Washington State next year, go out the Strait of Juan de Fuca in our new boat, make a left-hand turn, and come right down the Pacific coast. My boy is 11 years old now. He's already figured it out. Hey, Dad. Yes, son. Driving a boat down the Pacific coast, isn't that one of them high-risk, low-frequency events you speak of? Good for you, son. And it is high risk. It is high risk. Take a look at some of the places on the map, right on the coast. Point doom, point death, point you're gonna die, point 15,000 boats have sunk here already. Do you feel lucky, punk? Well, do you? Point, if you got this far, you're one lucky SOB. You know, I said, very good, Jakey. That is a high-risk, low-frequency event. But there's two types of high-risk, low-frequency events. The DTs and the NDTs. Time to think it through and no time to think it through. These are the ones that scare the hell out of me, folks. Right here. What I like to call the HR, LF, NDTs. Tasks that are very risky, done very rarely, with no time to think it through. And the bad news for us in public safety in general, and you in the fire service in particular, is that we have a number of these HR, LF, NDTs. High risk, low frequency, no time to think it through. Let me give you some classic risk management, ladies and gentlemen. If you study consequences, these can be identified through a study of consequences. And once these high-risk, low-frequency, non-discretionary time tasks have been identified, they can be addressed through a serious training program. A serious training program that focuses every day on HR, LF, NDTs, where every day is a training day. What will we do if this happens? What will we do if this happens? High risk, low frequency, non-discretionary time tasks. These scare the hell out of me, folks. The good news for you is most high risk, low frequency tasks have total, absolute 100% discretionary time. Most of the high-risk, low-frequency events that you will ever get involved in, not all, but most of them, there is time to think them through. Time to think them through. This is the most valuable information I can give you, ladies and gentlemen. You have time on a task, slow down.
Hopefully quite an entertaining video, but with a good message. And yeah, I think it was a video that was shown to me when I started with an emergency service. But I think there's real value in thinking about it in an outdoor context. And where he says, the ones that are really scary, the low frequency, high risk, no time to think about them once. I really struggle to find examples of when we're in the outdoors and we might face those kind of decisions. And I struggle to think of examples in businesses where we have to make decisions that quickly. When you're facing a raging fire, for sure, you've probably got those kind of decisions, but we're in a fortunate position that we don't actually have to make that decisions of that nature very often, as he says. And actually, when we do have to make a decision of that nature, say, for example, you're in the mountains and there's a rockfall, well, we're just going to do what we're going to do, and we have to accept that that's a risk. It's an inherent risk with the activity that we're participating in. And there's very little training, as he discussed. You can go through a rigorous training program. We can't create a rigorous training program to hone your decision making when you're in a rockfall, for example. But the beauty and the great thing about discussing outdoor decision making is that we're in a good space. We're in a space where lots of our decisions don't even sit in that high risk, low frequency space. Lots of what we're actually deciding is about moderate risk, and good decision making means we can hopefully stay within that moderate to low risk, not put ourselves in those high risk situations. But then equally, when we do end up in the high risk, low frequency spaces, we're not under the time pressure. And one of the things we'll discuss a little bit later, and I am conscious of time, is traps that we might fall into. And just by nature of receiving a grant or support from Mastering Mountains, your decision making is already weakened. And we'll explore that a little bit later. There's already a bias that will be challenging your decision making. And it's for you and for Mastering Mountains to create a culture that minimizes the effect that can have. We'll explore that shortly. Gordy's chart is a little bit hard to see on the page as he's frantically scribbling notes on it, but this is it in a bit of a nutshell. And I think it's important to appreciate, he talks about that top left high risk, low frequency space, but we need to be aware of it as we're creeping into it. So as risk is increasing, it's not all about once you reach this space, it's the moderate risk, moderate frequency. We need to be more aware of those than the low risk, low frequency. And so it's a blob at the top of the corner that spills out into many directions. And the outdoors is something that your decision making is honed over time. It's very difficult to gain the experience of the outdoors to support your outdoor decision making from theoretical sessions like this one. I'd love to do a in-person session where we can go out and actually live and breathe decision making, share decision making, discuss decision making in the field. And that's one of the challenges, is that we're also facing low to medium frequency in comparison to other decision making that we're making. Every single day, we probably decide what time we're going to wake up. That's a super high frequency decision that we're making. How often do you decide whether you're going to be crossing a mountain pass on a multi-day hike? Pretty low frequency. But the great thing is that we can build some structures around that decision making before we're even in the field, and that will enable us to hopefully follow good processes to have good outcomes. So to get into the meat of things a little bit, I think that set a lot of context. on the slide here is some principles that we'll work through to give you hopefully some takeaways to think about the next time you're going into the outdoors, hopefully before you get into them. And just to touch on the picture in the background, for those of you that know the sort of Mount Cook region, that's taken on the Bull Pass crossing. So that goes from the Hooker Valley to the Tasman Valley, fortunately before the big washout happened. And in the picture is me talking to one of my friends that is out in the mountains. And this picture, I think it's just a good example. I have no idea what we're talking about. I'd love to be able to say, oh, we're having a really great decision about the intricacies of a decision that we're about to make. I have no idea what we were talking about, to be honest. But it's a wild context. We're in the heart of the mountains, but we're sat or we're stood, and the sort of body language is just stood there having a chat. We're taking the time, and this time could be what we're taking to make a consequential decision. Kirsten, I think you talked about creating space to make decisions at the start. And I think what you were talking about is when Gordy in the video is yelling at us to slow down. If we can create the space to make the decisions, often the decisions that we make are more thought through. We follow better processes. So I think we're already in a really good space. Going through these from the top, so hopefully they're in formats that you can kind of take away a little bit, which is the S.A.D factor, to stop, assess, and decide. Stopping is the first step to making a decision, and that doesn't have to be a physical stop, but it almost needs to be a mental stop. So we know and recognize when we're entering into a decision-making process. And although we're constantly making decisions, am I going to put my foot there? Am I going to put my foot there? When we're coming into these these decisions that are creeping up towards that top left-hand side of the box, let's recognize that we're making a substantial decision. So we want to stop, we want to assess, and then we use that assessment to make our decision. So how do we assess? And I think the key thing here is to be constantly gathering evidence. And this is really, really important in the outdoors. And in my notes here, I've written, be observant and be obsessed. So the key thing that we can be doing, and it's flowing into the constantly gathering evidence, is this observation. What evidence do we have to make our decisions? So the more we look, the more we see. And so when we're out in the outdoors, whether it's out paddling along a river, cycling somewhere, or walking somewhere, if we're cycling our bike, if we're feeling the bike, we're observing the bike and how it's going, we might notice that things just feel a little bit off with that bike. That might be, I'm no cyclist, it might be the thing that turns your chain. What's that called? The crank on a bike. Yeah, Nick's nodding. That might be getting worn, and you just go, oh, something feels a little bit off, just 10% off. Doesn't mean we have to completely stop, but we've just got a little data point that's supporting us. Or as we're walking, we just go, things feel a little bit firmer underfoot than I initially thought. And we're low down in the mountains and we've got to go over a pass, and we just go, I wonder if it's going to, like, we're walking on a sort of frozen ground at the moment. Is it going to be icy up the top of the mountain? Just these tiny little data points, if we're constantly harvesting them and looking for them, then that's going to support us making a decision. And we may not necessarily recall every single data point that we've got, but all those little pieces of information come back to what Rafaela said, which is your gut feeling. Your gut feeling is a mixture of what Gordy was talking about, the previous experiences informing our decision making going forwards, but it's also a lot of subconscious collection of data that we're not bringing front and center, but we're just going, oh yeah, something's a bit off here. So making sure that we're constantly being observant, we're being obsessed about it. So we're constantly looking for evidence. Identifying key decision points in advance. The longer the duration, I think the more valuable it is to identify your decision points in advance. Our decision making gets worse, and it's been proven in various studies, the more fatigued we get. And we can then enter into a point where we perceive or we miss opportunities to make decisions. And sometimes in day-to-day life, not making a decision is okay. We can defer the decision. But when we defer and don't make decisions or don't intentionally defer decisions in the outdoors, from my experience, are the ones that come back and bite us in the bum. However, if we've identified key decision points, then we can really start to harvest the data, be observant and gather the observations along the way in the lead up to that decision point. So you might be looking for things that are going to support your decision making. And we then have a framework and a process. Gordy talks about the ice cream, how you have to scoop the ice cream and the way in which you do it. Identifying when you're going to be making your decisions in advance can support that. We need to make sure that we're holding that in an ability alongside our ability to think and assess along the way. So we go, okay, well, there's going to be a decision point here, 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 and here along my day or along my journey. But we also need to be able to make changes to the original plan. So plans are great, but we also need to review and adapt plans based upon the evidence that you're constantly gathering. When we're gathering the evidence, I like to think about a risk radar. So as you're walking along, if you think you've sort of got like two sonars coming out of your eyes typically, but also your ears and your feelings and your smells, all sorts of senses. And we're scanning everything, and we can break down our evidence into three factors: the people, the environment, and the equipment that we're using. It tends to be quite common for people to focus on two, but it seems to be quite difficult for people to hold enough in their head to focus on three. And so one of the things that I've adopted to try and improve my decision making is to go through the three factors there: the people, the environment, and the equipment, and go, what am I considering for the people, the environment, and the equipment? And that process, and that's part of the process that I go through for decision making, supports me in ensuring that all factors are covered off when I'm making a decision. With that one, can people perhaps think and share of a example of a time that perhaps they haven't considered one of those factors and it's resulted in a poor outcome, perhaps?
When I was a teenager, and I'd just begun tramping above the snow line, a mate and I would try to do a small peak up in the North Island, and we didn't have ice axes. That's like a pretty key piece of equipment that we didn't have. And it was my friend's first tramp. So like people scenario wasn't great. And we ended up having to change our plans, made some poor decisions. And like I came away actually feeling quite lucky to be alive, just because we didn't have the ice axes, and we could have very nearly, we hit some ice in a very steep setting. And so, yeah, so not having the equipment and questionable people situation, yeah, that was very nearly a disastrous scenario.
And did you have any key decision points identified?
Not prior to leaving.
Once you'd left, what did you identify as the key decision points?
When we got into the top of, or close to the top of this peak, the snow was about waist deep, and it was taking us way, way longer than we thought. And we realized that we weren't going to be able to complete the sort of traverse of this peak to a pass. And so we decided, and it had begun snowing a bit, the weather was deteriorating, and we were aware of that. And so we decided to turn around. We could see the hut directly beneath us, and so we decided to go down this icy gut into a stream, which would take us to the hut. So there was a decision point, and then we got to the bottom of the icy gut, and so that was like a whole ordeal. But we got to the bottom, and then we came to a waterfall, and we decided to try and go down the waterfall, even though everything around it was covered in ice, rather than go back up. And we kind of did that decision multiple times with the multiple waterfalls that we encountered down the way. So there were a bunch of key decisions, but yeah, it was the decision-making quality was just getting worse and worse and worse, really.
And I think that leads quite nicely to the next point, which is an acronym P.A.C.E, P-A-C-E, which by the sounds of it, Nick had a primary plan, which was to go to the top of the peak. I'm not quite sure, but I don't know whether he'd identified the alternative plan in advance, and then quite quickly was into his contingency, and it sounds reasonably close to going to the emergency plan. But the planning that we can do in advance reduces the fatigue of decision making in the field. And so when planning a trip, whether it's a day, a multi-day adventure into the outdoors, I think this PACE acronym becomes quite useful. So the primary plan, so this is basically our A-star plan. This is the best case scenario, and our preferred route or approach is the ideal plan based on the expected conditions. So these plans are built around the intelligence or the evidence that we've already gathered. So we're doing our homework, and then we're going, okay, well, what is the primary plan based upon the homework that we're doing? And so for Nick's example, he probably won't mind me picking on him. Nick's example, hopefully they had identified or that there was going to be substantial snow ahead. And so that would have been under their people, environment, equipment. When they were assessing the environment before even getting out there, they would have identified that there was going to be substantial snow ahead. When they think about their equipment, they would then be thinking about whether they need an ice axe, and then they would be thinking about the people. Do the people have the skills necessary to use the ice axe, for example? And if he'd have gone through that process and gone, we have ice axes, we know it's going to be snowy, and we've got the skills to manage it, then great. The primary plan could be to charge on up to the top of the mountain, and that's all good. And there's quite a chunk of risk associated with that, but it's you've gone through a process, you've identified a risk, you've put in place mitigation strategies. We can't criticize that decision just on that in isolation. And when Nick goes and slips and breaks his ankle, we don't go, Nick, you made a terrible decision. And this comes back to the first slide. We go, well, what did you thought about before you got yourself into that situation? And he goes, well, I thought about the people, the environment, the equipment. I had a primary, alternative, contingency, and emergency plan. I did all my homework. I stopped, I assessed, and I decided. I was constantly assessing the risks. And we go, oh, yeah, cool. Well, sometimes bad stuff happens, and that's okay. We don't go, oh, you made a terrible decision to go into the mountains those days, or we shouldn't go that way. Culture sometimes does the latter, but hopefully we can look a bit more at the process. So we've discussed the primary plan. The alternative plan is a backup plan if the primary one fails. It's still a viable and pre-planned option, but it might be less ideal. So this might be something that a lot of you are thinking about in quite a bit of detail for upcoming trips. So I think Nick works with you guys when thinking about what your objectives are for the grants and the objectives that you have. And it is going through, well, yeah, if everything's going great, we can go ahead with the primary plan. But there's all sorts of factors, and a factor for for many people receiving these grants is variation in their health on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis. And an alternative plan is not a bad plan. It's not a bad outcome. It's an alternative. In the same way that we can turn left, we can also turn right. Both plans are good plans. It's still a viable plan and it's pre-planned. And so this mentality that the alternative plan is okay supports good decision making. The alternative plan is not a failure. The alternative plan is not of any less value than the primary plan, but what it is giving you a secondary direction that enables you to make a good decision. Because if we only had a primary plan and we only had a contingency or an emergency, either you're going to just force through your primary plan through sort of dedication and a drive to achieve the primary plan, or we end up in a really bad situation. So we need to build alternative plans that are acceptable, and typically involve a minor adjustment, but still have good outcomes. However, as we all know, unexpected stuff happens, and so we need to have contingency plans, and these are our more drastic changes in approach. So it might involve significant scaling back of what you're planning to do. It might involve, if you're doing a 3-day hike, it might involve doing day 1 and then just returning back to the base, turning around and reversing day 1 on day 2 rather than completing the trip to day 3. So these are the big things where typically people feel disappointed if they end up falling back onto a contingency plan. But the contingency plan has huge value because it's a sharp enough change in direction to eliminate some substantial risks. So our contingency plan eliminates particular risks that have become apparent. So for example, if you're going up a peak and you're using Nick's example, you weren't expecting any snow and you get to the top and you do your people, environment and equipment thought process and you haven't got an ice axe, your contingency plan there might be to do a complete 180 and walk all the way back down. That for some people might be a disappointing outcome. It's that substantial change in what you're planning to do. It's not just going, we won't go over the really steep bit, we'll go round the side. But the contingency plan prevents us ending up in our emergency plan. And as hopefully you'll understand, an emergency plan is the last resort if everything else fails. So this is, for example, saying, well, I've got a personal locator beacon on me. That's part of my emergency plan. If something bad happens, then we're just going to shelter in place until rescue arrives. So making sure that we go through all 4 stages of the plan is really, really important. So to touch on recognized prime decision making, it's a fantastic tool, as Gordy says, but it utilizes skills gathered through previous experiences and training, so we can train our decision making. These are basically the shortcuts that we can take, so we don't have to consciously make every single decision in the day. And there's various things. You walk into a room, you don't think, should I turn the light on if it's dark? You just reach and turn the light on. These things are built out of experiences that we've had or training that we've had. So when you look at doctors, for example, they've had training that they don't have to think through every single process that they go through. It becomes instinctive, and we have gut feel that Rafaela mentioned earlier. That's part of this recognized prime decision making. It's our gut feeling. It's that we've gathered little bits of information and we say we've got a gut feel, but actually that's our recognized prime decision making kicking in and going, hey, do this. And we sometimes can't explain why we're doing that, but we just get a feeling and we go, this is the way to go. And it's hugely powerful. The challenge is that recognized prime decision making has some quite substantial flaws. And that is in that we can quite often underappreciate the difference between the previous experiences that we've had and the new experience that we're facing. And this becomes really apparent in the outdoors, where we're trying to manage so many different factors. So it's not just the people, it's also the environment, it's also the equipment, and the environment being a huge factor in this, in that, what's happening with what's under our feet, what's happening in the sky. Is it too hot? Is it too cold? How are those things changing? What direction are they heading in? And so relying too heavily on our recognized prime decision making can result in us missing some evidence that might further support improved decision making processes. So that leads us to a concept called heuristic traps. So heuristics, also recognized prime decision making is the shortcuts that we use. And these these six categories here are some of the pitfalls that we might fall into when using that recognized prime decision making. So these become particularly apparent in high risk environments because they exacerbate the problems that we have. So the first one being familiarity. So when we've done something many times before, we might say things like, I've walked down this slope 10 times before, it's always been safe. And so we're relying on our previous experience that we've walked down a slope many, many times, it's always been okay. But what we might be underappreciating there is that the conditions underfoot are different on this particular day. And so we go, yeah, no worries. I always go down this route. It'll be fine today. Classic example is if people surf. They go out at their same break every single day, every single week, but then the waves are different. They might look the same, but perhaps there's a increased strength on the swell, and then the person ends up in difficulty and they go, yeah, but I've surfed this wave my whole life. That's their familiarity. They're not appreciating that although it appears familiar, something has changed, and they perhaps haven't done enough evidence gathering and followed a robust enough process to make a good decision. Acceptance being the second one. So with regards to acceptance, we as humans often try to seek the approval of others, and this might result in us trying to fit in and avoid looking weak or unable to do a particular task. So an example here might be I'm in a group and I'm not feeling very well, or I'm in a group and I'm really exhausted, but I just want to support everyone and keep going. I don't want to be the one that results in us not completing the hike, for example. And so we end up making a poor choice because we're trying to fit in with the crowd, essentially. With regards to commitment, this is one that is going to be a big challenge, as I mentioned before. One of the challenges for mastering mountains is that we increase people's commitment to particular objectives, which make it harder for them to essentially say, hey, actually, no, this isn't working for me. So once we're committed to a goal, people push on despite warning signs. And it clouds our ability to appreciate the evidence around us. And so that's something that we need to be really aware of when participating, for example, in the sort of headline goals that you've all identified as part of your grant applications, in that you go, what I'd love to do is cycle the Old Ghost Road, for example. When you're cycling the Old Ghost Road and Mastering Mountains has said, yep, we'll support you, and your family's all around you or your friends are all around you going, yep, we'll support you, it becomes harder and harder and harder and harder for the evidence to be appreciated that would support good decision making. The expert halo. This one is a classic trap that instructors, mountain guides, kayak guides fall into, which is that I've been doing this for years, so I must know what I'm doing. And I have a really good friend. His name is Rich, and he's a ski patroller. He works at Porters, and his kids love backcountry skiing, and he's instilled an amazing culture amongst them that I think his about 12-year-old kid can question any decision in the ski field that his dad makes. His dad knows a lot about avalanche safety, ski safety, all that kind of stuff, but he's built a culture whereby his child and another group member can say, hey, are you sure about that? And that's his way of combating this expert halo. So he's not railroading, he's not making all the decisions. It's a groupthink mentality, and everyone has an equal voice. And there's been multiple times where he's changed his decision based upon some observation that one of his kids has made. And I think that's just amazing. That's golden. Tracks and scarcity. So we often identify opportunities to go into the outdoors. So we go, oh, great, the weather's looking great this week. I'm going to go and try and go for a hike, or I'm going to go and swim or cycle or whatever it is that we do. And we go, well, if I don't do it now, it's probably going to be winter before we know it, and I'm not going to be able to do it at all. That's a trap, because it's increased our commitment to things. It's clouded our judgment and our ability to appreciate the evidence that we're gathering, because we've got this emphasis that it's now or never. But good decision making in the outdoors, or following robust processes to end up with good decisions in the outdoors, means you get many, many opportunities to go out into the outdoors. The social factor, or social proof, people take greater risks in a group setting than they would alone. So when we're out in the outdoors, we look over and we go, oh yeah, they've headed there, so it must be all right. Or oh well, I was chatting to Nick, and he said last week he went up and walked up to Mueller Hut, for example. Therefore, walking up to Mueller Hut this week must be okay. And we underappreciate that, again, things are changing, things are constantly changing, and that just because it's good for somebody or it's worked out for somebody else doesn't necessarily mean it will work out for you. One of the challenges is that there's no clear way that's been identified for us to manage these heuristic traps. The best thing that I'm aware of that we can do to manage them is to be aware of them and to assess which ones are impacting us and our decision making. So I feel like I'm not delivering enough with the heuristic traps. I'd love to be able to go, and now what you need to do is this, 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 and this, and you'll never fall into any of those traps. I don't have that solution. And as far as I've looked, I can't find that solution. But what I can say is to be aware of them and consider them and which ones are impacting you when you're making decisions in the outdoors. And that's probably the best that we can do in this regard. So that's a bit of a wrap on what I wanted to cover and share. I appreciate it's probably quite a lot of information, but hopefully it's given you some insight into decision making, some tools to use for decision making, and some of the concepts around how we may frame decisions in the outdoors. If we go back to this slide, utilizing things like the stop, assess, decide, considering the people, environment, and equipment, and then coming up with your primary, alternative, contingency, and emergency plans are hopefully tools that you can take away and utilize when planning and out in the field doing some of your outdoor adventures.